This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Welcome everyone to this week's special edition of All Parsha on Parshas Beshalach. This year is going to focus on 4 Rambans on Parshas Beshalach. This is the All Parsha edition of the Ramban on the Parsha, and I would like to share with you 4 passages from the Ramban. We're going to begin with Perek Tes Zayin, Pasuk Daled, and the Ramban comments on the pasuk when Hashem says to Moshe, "Vayomer Hashem al Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim." I'll pour down bread from the heavens. V'yatza ha'am, and the people will go out. V'laktu, and they'll collect v'ayom b'yoymai, each day on its day. Lama'an anasenu, so that I can test them. Hayelech b'sayrasiyim lai, will they follow my Torah or not? So the pasuk is saying that the man served as a test for the Bnei Yisrael, and the question is, what was Hashem testing them? So the Ramban begins by bringing Rashi's pshat. It says, Ramban, im yishmeru mitzvos hatuliyos bai. The test will be whether the Jews observe the commandments that are dependent on the man. Number 1, shelo yosiru mimenu, they're not allowed to leave over. Hashem commanded in pasuk Yotes not to leave over, and v'lo yatzu b'Shabbos lilkait, and that they cannot go out on Shabbos to collect. This was the test of the man, if they would follow the directives associated with the man. Lashon Rashi, this is how Rashi understands the pasuk. However, the Ramban disagrees with Rashi. The Ramban says, Ve'inenu nachan. The Ramban says this is not correct. The Ramban feels that it's not sound to understand that the test of the man was narrow, merely whether the Jewish people would be following the specific directives of the man, but it's more broad than that, and that is, Ramban learns the test of the man was that even though the Jewish people had no previous knowledge of what man was, and whether in fact it could feed and satiate them, nevertheless they followed God into the desert, indicating their emunah and trust in Him. Avlahu kumaysha amar. Rather, the test of the man is similar to that which it says in Devarim, Perek Ches Pasuk Tes Zayin, Hama achilcha man bamidbar. He feeds you man in the desert, asher lo yadun aveisecha, which your forefathers did not know, l'man anoischa, in order to afflict you, l'man nasoisecha, in order to test you, lehitivcha ba'achrisecha, to do good to you in your end. What does that refer to? Ki nisoyinhu. This test was shelo yeh biyad hamazon. They didn't have any food in their possession. V'lo yiru lohem eitz b'midbar rak haman. They had no idea of how they would survive in the desert other than through the man, which they didn't know at first what it was. It's not like their forefathers or their parents could comfort them. Don't worry, Hashem's going to give you the man. They didn't even know what man was. That's why they called it man. Man means, what is this? And it's something that would come down daily, and after it came down in the morning, they were already hungry, not knowing what they would eat the next day. And nevertheless, they didn't rebel. And despite all this, they listened to follow God into the desert, which was not a place of bread. So according to Ramban, the test of the man was more broad than the narrow directives of whether they would follow the commandments associated with the man. The Ramban supports this position of understanding what the test was. V'kacha amar lohem oid. Similarly, Moshe said to them further in Devarim, V'zachartes kol haderech asher hoylicha Hashem lekecha zeh 40 shana. You should remember the whole road that God took you, these 40 years, ba'midbar, in the desert, l'man anoischa, in order to afflict you, l'nasoischa, to test you, ladas es asher b'lvavcha, to know what's in your heart, hasishmar mitzvahs of imloi, whether you will observe the mitzvahs or not. Now, according to Rashi, where the test of the man is only regarding the specific mitzvahs, well, there is no mention of the man in this pasuk, of God took you through the desert for 40 years to test you. There's no mention of the man in this pasuk. So according to Rashi, it's somewhat problematic. If the whole test was the directives of the man, why isn't the man mentioned in this pasuk in Devarim regarding the test? But according to the Ramban, where the test was broader than that, the test was whether the Jewish people would follow God into the desert, so it's not necessary to mention the man specifically. The test was whether we would in fact follow God into the desert. God could have guided us and taken us through cities, asher svivaseim, that would be, Hashem could have taken us on a road that was surrounded by cities, midbar. Instead, He took us in the desert, which was a place of Nachash Saraf Akrav, a place of the snake, a serpent, scorpion, and all they had was the bread from heaven on a daily basis. And this was to test them, to test them, in order to do good to them in their end. What does that mean, to do good to them in their end? That they should believe in Him and they would be rewarded, and inculcate eternal emunah into their being, she'aminu b'ayla olam, that they would believe in Him forever. Now, the Ramban says, by the way, regarding the purpose and the objective of a test, this is something that he commented on already in Bereshis, on the pasuk V'Hashem Nisas Abraham, and the opinion of the Ramban is that a test is not for the Rebbeinu Shalom to determine the value of a person, because the Rebbeinu Shalom already knows what a person's capabilities are, but rather to bring out a person's potential, what is called min hakoyach el hapoyel, from potential to actualization. And the Ramban says, "Kvar pirashti tam hanisoyin b'pasuk v'alikim nisas Abraham." Now, the Ramban quotes the opinion of the Rambam in the Mar Nevuchim, who learns that a test is for something else. V'harav Omar b'Mar Nevuchim. The Rambam writes in the Mar Nevuchim that the purpose of this test was ladas kol yoidea, so that anyone who is able to know can know, ulenasois hayesh toyelas ba'avodas Hashem, whether they could determine, in fact, is there benefit in serving God. This way, every knowledgeable person can watch what happens to the Jewish people, watch their service of Hashem, and learn from it that indeed those who serve Hashem are rewarded, are cared for, are supplied, are provided for. And whether they're given ample provisions. And the Ramban summarily rejects the Rambam's interpretation of what the test was. If the purpose was so that others should know that those who follow the will of God are indeed provided for, the pasuk should say, Laman anasenu, so I can test them, that they should know, or that it should be known. Now, the Ramban turns to address another question, and that is, what the Ramban wants to determine is the Bnei Yisrael complained for two things. They wanted bread to eat. If you look in Pasuk Gimel, the Pasuk says, the Bnei Yisrael said, we should have died in Mitzrayim when we had meat to eat, when we had bread. God took us out to kill us in starvation. So the people complain for bread and meat. And in Pasuk Ches, Moshe Rabbeinu says, God will give you bread and meat. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Moshe says, God will indeed give you bread and meat. However, in our pasuk Daled, all we have is the man. But Moshe Rabbeinu does not address the bread. So, says Ramban, V'nei lo hiskar kan rak dvar haman. In this pasuk, only the man is mentioned, Shuhu alechem sheimter lehem, which is the bread that God brought down to them. Aval kasha amar lehem Moshe, but when Moshe tells them later in pasuk ches, v'seis Hashem lachem be'erev basar, when God will give you in the evening meat, lecha to eat v'lechem ha'boker l'sbaya, and bread in the morning to be satisfied. So, wait a second, did God in fact promise to give the meat? This pasuk, which is God communicating to Moshe, God just says, I'm going to give them bread. And then Moshe says, God's going to give you bread and meat. Hashem never said that He's going to give them meat. But if Moshe told the Jewish people that indeed God will give them meat, that means Hashem communicated to Moshe that He will supply meat. So why doesn't it say in this pasuk? And the Ramban advances a general principle in Torah that when you have God telling Moshe, and then Moshe relaying to the people, sometimes information appears on one end of it that doesn't appear on the other. And the reason the Torah does that is the Torah is being concise. It is what we call divrei Torah, aniyim b'makam echad v'ashirim b'makam acher. Torah is, so to speak, impoverished in one place but wealthy somewhere else. The Torah doesn't have to say in both places, God said to Moshe, I'm going to give them bread and meat. And then Moshe says to the people, I'm going to give them bread and meat. We could figure out and extrapolate one and apply it to the other. Aval Katz says the Ramban Yadanu ki hakol nemar alai. Clearly, everything was told to Moshe. Aval Katz v'yikaser b'dvarim hanechbalim. Often the Torah is concise on matters that are repeated, be'inyan atzivoy, either regarding the command, oy basipor, or in the narrative. Kasher eskarti l'cha pamim rabim, as I mentioned many times. And I'll give you an example of something that we learned already regarding the Makkah of Arba. The Ramban learns that Hashem tells to Moshe, Boy el Parai, go to Parai, and Hashem, in the pasuk, nothing is mentioned regarding that Moshe was not told in this pasuk about Makas Arba. And then Moshe goes to Parai and he says, oh, God's going to bring Arba. But it doesn't say in the pasuk that God told Moshe about the Arba. So Ramban says what's missing in one place is explained fuller elsewhere. And that's another example of this principle. Upa'amim lo yazker ha'echad klal. Sometimes the Ramban says that pasuk doesn't mention one of these at all, meaning sometimes the command is missing and Moshe just tells the people, but clearly God commanded Moshe. Or sometimes we'll have God commanding Moshe, and we don't find Moshe told the people, but certainly he told the people. Kakosav Parshas Hazois, like we find in this Parsha, Zehadavar Shatziva Hashem Eloi HaOmer Mimenu. Moshe tells the people, God says, collect an Omer. We don't find any mention that God in fact told Moshe, collect an Omer. And likewise, in many places, says Ramban, that according to the opinion that lechem refers to all food, so then you could say when God says, I'm going to give you lechem, he was referring not only to the man, but to the slav as well, because they asked for bread and meat, and lechem refers to both. Let us now turn to Parak Tes Zayin, Pasuk Yud Beis. We have a very important comment of the Ramban, and that is, the Ramban says in Pasuk Yud Beis that the Rebbeinu Shalom communicates, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Lemar, Shamati Esunos Bnei Yisrael, I heard the complaints of Bnei Yisrael, say to them, saying, in the evening they will eat meat, and in the morning they will be satisfied with bread, and you will know that I am the Lord. So the question the Ramban is bothered by is, in Pasuk Ches earlier, Moshe tells the people, Vayomer Moshe b'seis Hashem lachem be'erev basar, God will give you meat in the evening, lechav lechem b'boker l'spaya, and bread in the morning, because b'shmaya Hashem eslunoi seichem, God heard your complaint. So why is the Torah repeating that God tells Moshe, I heard their complaint? Moshe already told the people that the Rebbeinu Shalom heard their complaint. Says Ramban that we will paraphrase, this command was already said in Pasuk Ches, but it was repeated over here because Hashem is saying, I heard the complaint of the Jewish people. What is that referring to? Says the Ramban, in the beginning in Pasuk Dalid, Hashem said, I'm going to give you bread. You could understand that to mean that Hashem is doing a chesed to them, either as a manner of goodwill, that Hashem in his kindness is doing a chesed to them through his grace, or because of their schusim. And now Hashem is saying, not so fast, I'm not just doing a kindness to you, but rather, says the Ramban, Hashem is making it clear that Ata higid kinechshav lahem la'avain. Hashem is now saying that I consider what you asked for to be a sin, and I'm giving it to you because you complained, that you should know that I am Hashem, because, meaning until now, I don't think you really believe and have faith in me, that's why you're complaining against me. So according to the Ramban, the reason why this pasuk is repeated is to indicate, don't think God is giving it to them as an offering of goodwill. God is making it clear that the only reason He's giving them the man is that He considers it a complaint. Or the Ramban offers another interpretation. It could be, says Ramban, that at first Hashem never promised that He's going to give them man for 40 years in Midbar. They thought, maybe the Jewish people thought they would get man for a day or for 2 days while they were there. And when they would travel on, they would find a 7-Eleven somewhere, or they would find some convenience store to buy food. But now God is saying, I'm going to give you meat in the evening and bread in the morning, meaning for good, consistently, constantly, always. Now, the Ramban brings an amazing pshat, because it comes out, according to this second pshat, that God is saying He's going to give them bread and meat always. Then not only did the Jewish people eat man for 40 years, according to this, says Ramban, the slav also fell for them daily like the man. Says Ramban, in support of this opinion of Chazal, look, the Jewish people complained about both the bread and the meat, and Hashem said, I hear your complaint about both, and I'm going to give in to your desire for both, because what good is meat and for a day or two, if they desired meat, then they're going to need it so long as they're in the desert. Now, the Ramban is bothered by a question, because the Torah, firstly, speaks about the man at great length. It talks about how it fell, and when it fell, and the directives of the man, and in a very abridged form, it talks about the slav. That would indicate the slav's falling was a one-time occurrence. Says Ramban, this parsha that it explains and speaks at length about the man and not about the slav, the reason for that is not because only the man fell for 40 years and the slav did not, but rather the reason for that is the man was entirely miraculous, as opposed to the slav. It was a natural process. The meat fell, but there was nothing supernatural about the essence of this meat. Now the Ramban is bothered by another question, because if you look in Bamidbar, in Parshas Behaloischa, about the second episode of the slav, the Misoinanim at Kivros Hatava, but why were they complaining then in the Midbar again about the meat if the meat fell daily for 40 years, according to what the Ramban is suggesting now? So then they had the meat the entire time. Why would they be complaining about the meat again? Says the Ramban, even though they had the meat, but kiloi balahem mimeno ata lasoiva. They had the meat, but not so much, and it wasn't satisfying. Like it says over here, that the bread was lechem lizbaya, but the basar was only basar lechal. And therefore, they complained because they just did not have enough basar. Or the Ramban says, it could be that this slav that fell was only collected by the Gedolim, the great ones, or the righteous ones, but the young men or the people of lower status were starving for the slav. Now the Ramban is suggesting that the slav did not fall for everybody. Maybe the slav only fell for the important people, and that is why it doesn't say by the slav that everybody collected the same amount, hamar v'hamamid, as it says by the man. And the reason is because not everybody got slav, and that's why in Behaloischa it says the asafsuf, the riffraff among them complained and were starving for the meat, and they gathered all of Bnei Yisrael, because not everybody indeed had the man. And then when the Rebbeinu Shalom gave them meat, he gave them a lot of meat. The pasuk says, even someone who collected a little bit, collected asara chamarim, and they ate it for a month, and then it went back to its original status, namely, according to Ramban and this pshat, that only the important people got the slav and not everybody else. Now, the Ramban concludes by offering what he says is the pashat pshat in the manner in which the slav worked. The Ramban says, Val derech hapshat, or the phenomenon, the manner in which the slav fell was leitim, was occasionally. The man was their main source of sustenance, and it fell regularly because their main complaint was they were starving and they wanted something to satisfy them, and that is typically what bread does. But the Ramban says, in his opinion, the slav only fell upon occasion, and God gave a sida to the request regarding the meat, but it was not something that fell at all times. Now, let me share with you a Ramban Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Tes at the end of the Parsha, regarding Moshe appointing Yoshua ben Nun to fight Amalek. Now it's interesting. What do we call Yoshua? Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Tes, Vayomer Moshe Yehoshua. Now we all know, in Parsha Shlach, the Pasuk says that Moshe called Hoshea ben Nun Yehoshua. And here it is, his name was not called Yehoshua yet, and he's being referred to as Yehoshua. Says Ramban, the fact that the Pasuk in Beshalach calls him Yehoshua indicates that Moshe, from the first day he knew Yehoshua ben Nun, he called him already Yehoshua. Moshe always called him Yehoshua, as we find in Kisisa, Vayishma Yehoshua, as Kalam Bereah. Yehoshua heard the people worshipping the Egel. There too he is referred to as Yehoshua, even though seemingly Moshe had not yet named him Yehoshua. The pasuk says Vayikra Moshe Losheh ben Nun Yehoshua in the context of the Meraglim. What it means is it's going back to the first day Moshe met Yehoshua. It's saying this man who you may know as Hoshea, you should know Moshe called him Yehoshua back in the day, already from the beginning. Now, according to Chazal, that Moshe called him Yehoshua because Moshe was davening Ka Yoshiacha Me'atzas Meraglim. God should save you from the spies. So that seems to indicate it was specifically at that juncture that Moshe Rabbeinu called him Yehoshua. You could say, says Ramban, that Moshe, being a prophet, knew that in the future Yehoshua would be in danger through the Meraglim, and he called him Yehoshua already from the first time he met him, al Shem ha'asid, based on what he would know, based on what he knew would be in the future of Yehoshua, that he was in danger from the Meraglim. Or the Ramban says, we could say as follows. Really, he was called Yehoshua from the beginning. The only thing was, that's what Moshe called him, but others knew him as Hoshea. And prior to the sending of the Meraglim, Moshe established for all time that from now on, everyone should know him as Yehoshua bin Nun. This is the Ramban on the name Yehoshua. Let us conclude with the concluding marks of the Ramban on this week's Parsha regarding the war against Amalek. And the Ramban wants to know, throughout our history, many nations have fought against the Jewish people. Why does Rebbe Shem have this very bitter vendetta against Amalek, that he pledges to eradicate them, and we too are commanded to eradicate them? The Ramban says, V'tam ha'oinesh, the reason for the punishment, shenenash Amalek yoser mikol ha'amim. These are the concluding words of Ramban of Parshas Beshalach. The reason why Amalek is punished more than any other nation, Ba'avor ki kol ha'amim shamu vayir gazan. The other nations heard about what God did, and they trembled. Upeleshes, uve'edoim, all the various nations, whether the Pelishtim, whether Edom, Moav, Yeshchanan, they all melted out of fear of God and His majesty. But Amalek comes from a distance. Amalek comes from far away. They're not threatened by the Jewish people. They're not in danger by the Jewish people. We weren't going to destroy them. Kimisgaber al Hashem, their kavana was not just to fight against the Jewish people, but to prevail against God Himself. And that is why in Kiseitze it says about Amalek, V'lo yarei Elokim, V'lakach amar b'v'lo yarekim. And, says Ramban, besides that, they're our relative. They were not in danger. They had their share. We were not coming to uproot them. They violated what the pasuk says in Mishlei, Oiver misaber ariv loylai. They got involved in a fight that wasn't theirs. We had no issues with them. We were not going to attack them. And as a relative, to get involved in a fight that didn't belong to them, that is why there's Milchama Lashem Ba'amalek Midar Dar. We should be Zoicha that the Yad Al Keska, that God's name, which is incomplete, and His throne, which is incomplete, should be Nishlam, should be completed through the eradication of Amalek, that it should occur B'mher V'yaminu. Amen. Wishing everyone a wonderful Shabbos.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.